Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Real Perspectives podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Vladimir Bosanac. I'm joined today by my other co-host, Tom Fischer. Tom, how are you?
Doing well, Vlad. Thanks for having me once again and look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, as always. Where do we find you today? Where are you?
I am where I typically am on Fridays working from home in San Francisco.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm in San Jose, so I guess we're, sort of anchoring the Bay Area here solidly. So.
Exactly.
Well, today's conversation is going to be interesting. We have a few fun topics to cover. One of them is going to touch on a little bit of the defense technology firms and their growth in Southern California. Then we're going to touch, obviously, kind of the extension of that, which goes to data centers and what data centers have been doing lately here, on the West Coast, but also across the country. There's some news with some states. We're going to touch a little bit on industrial. The industrial market has been evolving continuously, and will continue to do so, I think, over the next few years as well. And then finally, we're going to go over some of the macroeconomic drivers, things that are really kind of pushing the industry these days, certainly as it relates to interest rates and some of the kind of things that we can't control, that are out of our control in certain parts of the world that are impacting that. So those are like our big four topics that we're going to cover, and we'll get started here with defense tech in SoCal. So for our listeners, for those of you who may or may not be informed, but Silicon Valley essentially was started as a kind of a hotbed for technology after World War II, and a lot of money was put into building satellites and radar systems and all these other things. A lot of the kind of early tech firms like Fairchild and those folks were basically doing military tech before it became sort of personal technology stuff. And so recently, however, I have noticed that there's been quite a few companies growing in Southern California, and it's almost as if the script has flipped a little bit. Now, Southern California has had a strong base around El Segundo and Long Beach with Boeing and some other companies there, but recently, especially with SpaceX being there and Anduril, growing their kind of tech around drones and sort of war sort of space, right? That's where they've been growing. Tom, have you noticed this at all?
Yeah, it's certainly it is a topic that I have read several headlines around, and going back to your first point, Vlad, when you talked about the kind of the Bay Area being an old home to the defense industry, it was one of the reasons, being in real estate, that there's so many Superfund sites and cleanups sites in the Bay Area because of how those manufacturers polluted the ground below their facilities. But going back to you, I have noticed that. I'm just curious, what do you think are the drivers behind that move to Southern California, especially given Northern California, the Silicon Valley's historical base of all things new tech VC funded, and this would seem to be counter to what we've experienced before.
Yeah, it does seem from some of the research that I've done is that the funding still comes from Silicon Valley. It just that it seems that the expertise seems to be in Southern California more concentrated than up here in Northern California. Defense tech is more physical, so it's more hardware than software. I think Silicon Valley has become more of a hotbed for software development, and clearly we're seeing that with AI and all the other sort of companies building things around technology that is basically around browsers, if you will, right? But things like drones, missiles, satellites, autonomous subs, jets, these things need a machine shop, right? They need a prototype floor, they need test space, and they need skilled manufacturing labor. And so that seems to be one of the top drivers why it's going to Southern California. Also, the region down in Southern California the technology never really left that space. So Northrop, Raytheon, Boeing, SpaceX now, they've all maintained their footprint there, and in some cases grown it quite a bit. El Segundo is used to be an oil town, and now it's basically apparently the second highest density town of PhDs in California, and a lot of this goes into engineering, machine type work, and obviously in the aerospace. So those are kind of like the big sort of drivers. I think proximity to LAX, Long Beach ports, right, and there are several airports down in Southern California also, and then schools. I think we say this about I think Northern California. You have this axis between Berkeley and Stanford that generates all this amazing talent for the tech industry. I think in Southern California you have similar things like Caltech and UNC and UCLA that are driving that as well.
I'm curious, Vlad, do you think that there's any impact on, given the kind of the political leanings that are prominent in the Bay Area versus Southern California? I think most people would view California generally as a left of center, between slightly left or very left of center. But do you think there's any difference in the kind of political environments or particularly schools that impacts that?
I mean, it could be. I think certainly if you look at Orange County, I don't think Orange County can be put in the same bucket as left of center in most categories. They're probably right of center more so, and certainly Central Valley, does tend to lean more right, within the state. I do also think just the sort of geography. I think there's only so much growth that I think companies like these can have in this region. And whereas I do also see that Southern California, they just offers bigger space. There's just vaster industrial complexes, right? There's many more airports, right? I feel like there's probably like 10 little airports around the Los Angeles area. With San Diego especially, you have the Navy, right? A huge base there, and there is one company also that's doing sort of like submarine drones, right? So it is an interesting part of kind of California's growth, and I think it's going to continue to be more prominent. All the kind of news and headlines that we're seeing from the Ukraine-Russia war tend to lean towards the development of drones and kind of this lighter, less expensive sort of innovation, but tied to AI, which is going to now tie to our data center conversation in a couple of minutes. But that seems to be kind of the area of real growth versus like a Lockheed Martin building sort of a new jet, right, or something, right, or some satellite system, right. So those are, I think, those are, I think, some, that is the environment in which this will continue to grow, and I think continue to be a very, very strong sector for the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And then how do you think about, just in the context of, you had mentioned obviously what's happening in Ukraine as well as in Iran and the U.S. involvement there, that would seem to play into the impact of greater innovation and, like you said, more unmanned or autonomous vehicles in combat roles and taking greater
100%.
impact.
And I think I'm sure our military and our intelligence is very carefully watching how the war in Ukraine is playing itself out, and as a result we are seeing leasing pick up in Southern California, with sort of aerospace and kind of defense manufacturing firms, whether it's in Carson, whether it's in Torrance, Long Beach, Gardena, as I said, in El Segundo also. I'm not hearing those kinds of leases happening in Northern California, like Pleasanton or San Jose, or the sort of towns that we know here. But here you do see more AI stuff, right? So definitely more sort of software based versus this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. And also just a random historical thought. To my knowledge, El Segundo got its name as the second because it was the second largest or the second biggest refinery for the Standard Oil. So I find it a bit ironic that it's the second highest densities of PhDs in California. So now we have another reason to call El Segundo El Segundo.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, yeah.
And,
So anyway, interesting kind of way of how the industry is evolving. And again, as I said, this looking to be a very, very big, I think, sector for the state.
Yeah, and then of course you mentioned the Anchor Anduril expansion. I suspect you've heard or read about other expansions or other companies of note that are that have.
Yeah, some of the companies that we've researched include Flight Wave Aerospace, True Anomaly, Trino Manufacturing, Heart Aerospace, Millennium Space Systems. Again, these are not your Northrop Grummans, your Raytheons, your Boeings, your SpaceXs, right? These are, innovative firms that are now taking things, they're taking 90,000 square feet, 45,000 square feet, 30,000 square feet. And, I can see them, a year from now, doubling, tripling that, right? With their growth.
Yeah. And I think that, just the U.S. is our system of innovation is hopefully well suited to excel in this area, because it seems like as you had mentioned, the big defense programs of buying the next big airplane or multi-million-dollar jet is going to be replaced by this kind of technology and this kind of hardware.
Yes, yeah. The one thing that we did also notice is that this is not the only place where manufacturing for this type of industry is actually growing. And Anduril is putting some manufacturing in the Midwest, in actually Columbus, Ohio. And so I think what this means is that SoCal is winning on kind of R&D, prototyping, skilled assembly, sort of small batch, manufacturing where they're sort of trying things out. Mass production, if it tends to be, ready to go, could end up going other parts of the country. So,
sure.
We'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah, that dynamic makes sense. Certainly interesting topic and something to follow. I think it was, appreciate your research and thoughts on that. I think it's very interesting.
Absolutely. So let's jump to the data center world. So related to AI, obviously, this is a big topic here in Silicon Valley and other parts of California. But what have you seen?
Well, there was this week in New York, Governor Hochul put a 1-year moratorium on the building of AI data centers by hyperscalers. There's certainly been very vocal local opposition in places in California. I think, we were prepping for this call. You had mentioned a protest against Google and Alviso, and others are whether AI industry is suffering for a lack of PR or bad PR, they're starting to be in the crosshairs of a lot of advocacy against their industry. So thought it was an interesting topic to address just both the pros and cons of data centers, the typical issues that people raise around power, resource usage, so on and so forth. So it's topical and thought it would be a good conversation.
Yeah, 100%. We've reported on the city of Seattle, I think, imposing a moratorium for new development. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to stop. They're just going to kind of pause it. I believe the city of Monterey Park in Southern California, again, I'm more focused on the West Coast, so I hear these kind of things. But I know that I think Vermont, they're looking at similar stuff. I'm sure there's, other states and other, municipalities that are equally worried about the cost of energy, but also pollution. It's not without its sort of hazards, if you will, right? Where do you sit on this line, Tom? Do you feel like we're exposing ourselves to something that we can't control too much? Do you think that we should, build more? What's your personal view?
Yeah, I'm probably a little bit more straddle on this issue than most. I would say I understand the benefits, but I also recognize the costs that are involved. I think in the context of placing moratoriums on it, I do think there's some validity to the argument that if we don't do it, then others will accelerate and or win the race, if you will, that aren't necessarily the greatest actors in the world, and specifically being China. Do we want an AI industry that's developed by an open capitalistic society, or one that's more authoritarian and closed? So I go back and forth on that particular topic and understand the arguments for both sides. So that's kind of the first thing that pops into my mind in terms of, is it good or bad?
Yeah, my personal feeling is that we can't avoid it. I think, putting a moratorium on it, I'm not really sure what it does. I'm not really sure that it fixes the problem. I'm not really sure that in, let's say, those 12 months or however many, whatever amount of time we decide to kind of put a pause on things, that anyone does anything in between to actually resolve these issues, right? I think it's just more of kind of, okay, we couldn't resolve it, so let's go back to the drawing board kind of deal, right?
Yeah, we have that old saying that a decision deferred is a decision made is not a good rule to live by.
Exactly, exactly. And I do feel like, I don't think the U.S. can stay away from this. It's just not going to be possible. And I also don't think that capitalism is going to allow it. I mean, sadly. But I also think that there are ways around this. I do feel very strongly that companies that want to build data centers should bring their own power. I don't think that's impossible. I think we should invest in maybe micro nuclear plants or something. We should invest in solar. We should invest in all forms of energy, except fossil fuel. I will push back on that one because I don't think that's very helpful. But I do think that some of these smaller communities where you have like one utility that sort of is basically runs it half a state or the entire state, it can certainly be an issue, and sort of spreading some of those costs across a smaller number of households can be very detrimental. And so I think there's a way to do this. I think these hyperscalers can also basically bring their own heat. They are going to bring it because these servers require a lot of energy, and that heat could be also used for things like cleaning the water. If they're using the water to cool down the servers, you can also find ways to manage this. This is not hypothetical. So my understanding is that there are a couple of data centers that Microsoft is building in Finland, where they were forced to do this, and they're able to do it. So I think it's kind of a matter of maybe call it political will, citizen sort of will to kind of push the politicians to think about this beyond just should we build or not build. It's not just a binary decision. I think there's a lot of grayness between those two thoughts.
Yeah, 100% agree, Vlad, and I think that's well stated in the context of the power and resources. I completely agree that if these data centers can be closed loop systems and or from a water management perspective and build their own power plants or power sources, I'm all for that. I think the argument amongst the people who are in the industry and want to expand, they'll say, yeah, great, we want to get more power, but the utility is telling me it's going to take 8 years to hook it up. Or with the case of Microsoft restarting 3 Mile Island, that's great, but then the regulators will say, well, we're not, I think the plant can be up and running like in the next 12 months, but they're saying we can't hook it up to the system until 2030. So going back to your prior point is that, the constituencies, the utilities, particularly in the regulatory agencies, need to be able to provide or allow these builders to do those things. And I think it would allay a lot of the concerns that people living in these communities or other constituents have. Certainly, there's been a discussion about, does it dramatically increase electricity costs for certain? And there's no doubt, I would suspect there's cases for both. If it's a small utility in a rural area, then yes, that data center could be utilizing 30-40% of the peak power load. Then of course it's going to have a tremendous impact on other people's utility rates. Whereas like in Northern Virginia, which is one of the centers of data centers, you know, electricity costs have gone up over the last 24 months, but less than they have in other locations that have fewer data centers. So I think each location is going to be specific to its, you know, its power demand balance, where it's located, et cetera. But just wanted to close with, I certainly agree. I think there's ways for the data center builders to provide that, and just hope that the regulatory environment allows them to do it in a timely manner.
Yeah, and I think it's okay for us to look to other countries to see what they're doing. I know we often, are concerned what China is doing and how they're going to, pass us in this area or in that area. And it sounds like in energy generation, they've already passed us, because everything from what I'm kind of hearing and sort of headlines that I'm sort of seeing and reading basically state that energy there is like it's sort of a non-issue. So if you're like a tech company or you're doing whatever, it's really not that difficult to have access to energy. Whereas it seems to be a continuous struggle here. And so I am not a central planning kind of guy. But given that we have two electrical systems in this country, at some point, the Texas system and the rest of the country system, I think they're going to have some kind of central planning to sort of figure out, okay, how do we distribute this, right? And how do we get our, electric grid ready for this century, right? We are talking about stuff that was built post-World War II, for an economy that we couldn't even imagine, 80 years or so ago, right?
Yeah, no doubt. I think, and this is a back and forth that many people have about the system that's in place in China versus what we have. It's lots of independent actors here that need to collectively make a decision within the rule set that we have. Whereas in China, it's just like somebody at the top says, this is what's going to happen, and it happens. So right. They can build 100 new coal power plants in the last 24 months or whatever it was. And they certainly don't have the same focus on environmental quality as we do here.
Yeah, that is true. Although they are very, very strongly pushing into solar generation, right? They
control the
new installations there pop up, yeah. Right? Yeah. And those are things that we can do here on our end. There still seems to be a lot of pushback against solar, which I always find a little kind of curious. But be that as it may, hopefully, it'll again we can take sort of kind of examples from other parts of the world, including Europe and even I believe Pakistan, which of all places I think is in like it has installed something like the biggest array of private solar panels like in the world. I think they're the biggest importer of Chinese solar panels, which again. Their electrical grid is not very sophisticated, so kind of people are taking things into their own hands. I hope we don't get to that point, given that we can certainly find ways to resolve this. So those are some thoughts, and I am curious, if there are other solutions that we can play with. So.
Yeah, lots of money is getting thrown at it, lots of smart minds out there. Yeah. So I don't doubt we'll see some solutions. It'll be fits and starts. I think in closing, I totally agree. I don't see how the U.S. And the system, the capitalist system, and independent players and the amount of money that's involved in the business that the U.S. isn't a major player on a go-forward basis. Yeah. It's just hopefully there's some brighter minds and compromising minds that can find ways to get from A to B more quickly than we currently are seeing.
Yep, agreed. Well, our next conversation topic I wanted to bring up is on the industrial side. So there has been, industrial, as our audience probably knows, over the last few years has been kind of the darling of the industry. Certainly during COVID and explosion of the industrial sector, both in terms of development, leasing, rental rates. I mean, it was really on a tear across the country. Since then, things have slowed down a little bit, and I did a little bit of research because some of the headlines do say that industrial is maybe not as hot as it maybe was a couple of years ago, and then some of the research that I've done actually shows me that it seems to be doing relatively fine. There's one or two kind of markets where things are a little bit slower, but on the whole, I think the picture is relatively positive.
Yeah,
Tom, I know you're a multifamily person. This is not your sort of area of expertise, but have you seen anything? Has this bubbled up in your conversations anywhere?
Not really specifically, Vlad. And I'm a little bit surprised. I would tell you that just looking at asset classes, like you mentioned, we're focused on multifamily, so we track how our industry does, the benchmarks we have for the asset class versus others. And industrial, again, on a macro basis, hasn't performed as well in the last kind of 12, 18, 24 months. But so that is surprising. I'm curious, what markets specific markets were you seeing strength versus weakness based on your research?
Yeah, so Inland Empire, which is in Southern California, the largest industrial market in the country, it is at 8.8% vacancy. This is probably one of the highest in the country for that size.
Yeah, that's surprising to me. I would have thought it would have been lower.
If you compare it to Dallas, Fort Worth, Phoenix, Atlanta, Houston, New Jersey, Chicago, these are like the other kind of major markets. The only one that's higher than that is Phoenix, but Phoenix is a smaller market also. So overall, vacancy kind of on a nationwide basis sort of sits around 7%. That is actually a little bit lower than we were in Q1. Net absorption is positive. We are looking at about 62 million square feet in Q2. That translates to about 114 million square feet year to date. And these reports come from Cushman & Wakefield, so they're estimating that the demand is holding, and there's actually a little bit of an uptick year over year. However, I think where some of these vacancy numbers that are kind of hovering, especially with the big markets that are hovering kind of above 7-8%, we are as a result seeing construction in this space off quite a bit. So under construction, we have about 305 million square feet across the country. The peak, sort of the peak of the boom was about a billion square feet, right? Which sort of
Wow.
these are
Yes.
so these are enormous numbers,
hard to wrap your head around that.
how to wrap your head right. But basically, I think the point is we're about 30% of where off the peak. Now, should we measure the peak as where we need to be? Probably not. This is still a healthy number of construction, right? But similar to some of the if I can hit some of the vacancy numbers, so Dallas Fort Worth, which is sort of the second biggest market, 8.1%. Phoenix, like I said, about 10.8, so almost 11%. That's the highest. Atlanta 8.5, Houston about 6.3, New Jersey at about 8.3, and then of the big markets, Chicago is the one that's sort of the lowest at 4.8, which is interesting. And then another Southern California market, Los Angeles, which is not counted in Inland Empire numbers, is actually at 4.2 and hitting positive absorption. So LA market, a little different than your kind of big box sort of distribution centers, right, that you see in Inland Empire further to the east. I'm not surprised that the vacancy there is doing better.
Yeah, and certainly runs counter to just about every kind of sensationalist headline you hear about Los Angeles, about how it's doing and not doing well. In this case, it's seemingly doing exceptionally well.
Yeah, it is doing well. Whether that's exceptional, maybe we're in a couple of quarters where it is doing fine. Another market that we also track is the Pacific Northwest. The market there is not doing very well either. So it's not considered one of these sort of major markets like some of the ones that I mentioned. But that one is also, I think, struggling a little bit based on some of the numbers. The one thing because of this is you made a point about this, that you noticed that some of the performance in this industry is not as good, and clearly values are down. In Inland Empire, again, this is the one that's kind of doing the worst. Values there are off by about 40% from their 2022 peak, and they're off another 20% just year over year. So that's certainly one market because of its size that I think will be interesting to watch for what it means for the West Coast.
I'm curious, just two follow-up questions, Vlad, and based on what you read in the research, is the current demand still for the larger distribution spaces or more for smaller infill manufacturing? And then second, I'm curious how people think about immigration enforcement and tariffs on the impact of the supply and demand in the industrial market.
Yeah, I haven't I haven't heard immigration as one of the drivers. Tariff and trade policy is definitely one of the biggest ones, joined with an oversupply. So it looks like between kind of 21 and 23, those sort of early years of COVID, because of its success, there was a lot of development in this area. And so I think the market hasn't caught up to all of that quite yet, which I think is why we're seeing this sort of drop off in the development pipeline. The tenants seem to want to kind of settle in and renew more than kind of looking for new spaces and expansionary sort of spaces, which I think again is a sign of caution. Again, probably tied more to the sort of tariff and trade policy. Again, we're talking West Coast. Most of our goods on the West Coast here come from Asia. The tariffs have, I think, really played an impact there. Also, there's been a reset because of interest rates. There's been a reset on cap rates. And the financing has been harder to get by for construction, and so investors are probably, as you might expect, putting their money elsewhere.
Yeah, certainly we have seen and witnessed a similar dynamic in the multifamily space. The amount of development, new construction that started between 20 and 22, when debt, for lack of a better term, was almost free. And what that meant for cap rates and the availability of debt has largely dried up. And the deliveries, again, on a macro basis, you still have markets that are experiencing some continued supply issues. Interestingly enough, I saw Phoenix on here was the highest vacancy for the market, and we're experiencing a very similar dynamic on the multifamily side in Phoenix. So
also in Phoenix, interesting.
Some interesting parallels between those two asset classes on those items for sure.
Yeah, well, industrial has been also driven by retail quite a bit in the last sort of maybe call it decade or better half of the decade, and I wonder if that's been part of it as well. Although the population growth in Phoenix, you probably have a better sense of this. Where has that gone sort of since the last cycle?
Well, still positive, but I haven't looked at any recent numbers on a percentage growth. Again, it's a market that I suspect is extremely influenced by immigration, and given what has inspired or what has transpired on the immigration front in the U.S., I wouldn't doubt that the population growth is down fairly dramatically. And then, as we mentioned on our last podcast, was just from macro level, we're not seeing tremendous job growth and thus household formation on a macro level. Certainly there's markets like San Francisco AI that are booming, but it's not. It's fairly anemic across most of the country.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're seeing that in the numbers, I think. So that's for sure.
Absolutely.
So Tom, you have the last topic here, some of the macroeconomic drivers and what's happening around the world and kind of impacting that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Vlad. I think everyone's certainly been following with the memorandum of understanding in the Middle East between the U.S. and Iran, and that seems to have fallen by the wayside the last couple of weeks. Just thinking about the impact of that from a interest rate perspective, cost of oil, inflation perspective, and how that is flowing through the economy, and more telescoping down to how that's impacting the multifamily market, which is our area of focus. So just a couple of data points to highlight. In the last, call it 45 days since the MOU was originally announced, the ceasefire took hold and is now largely fallen apart. The 10-year Treasury is up 20 basis points. We're really up 15 to 20 basis points across the curve. The transaction volume year over year is down from the fourth quarter in 25, but that seasonality is fairly typical. So year over year, we're fairly flat. I would.
And is this transaction on the multifamily side?
On multifamily side,
Yep.
yeah. And I would suspect that the second quarter, I don't know that there's great numbers out yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a fairly dramatic drop off from the first quarter, just given this greater uncertainty. We're still, for the vast majority of markets, some other high level numbers. So San Francisco, according to Yardi, had 4.5% year over year rent growth. That seems actually understated from what I've been hearing anecdotally, whereas San Jose is up like 1%, Sacramento's like 0.5%. I would say the markets that we're in, Bay Area is killing it. Southern California is kind of in the middle, and the Pacific Northwest has been pretty flat, anemic. So really the topic was to highlight how this interest rate uncertainty has flowed down through the transaction volumes, with the overlay of, as we talked about earlier, the lack of serious household formation and demand. Although absorption of apartments is up, supply is down, we're still not seeing a lot of that. We're not seeing that translate into really strong rent growth, nor a fantastic transaction market.
Yeah, it is interesting. The 10-year is an indicator of where inflation is going to go, which tells you where the interest rates are going to go as well. So that's up. All of that is going up as well, unfortunately, or at least that's what the market is seeing. The one thing, we've had a couple of webinars here in the Bay Area over the last couple of weeks. The multifamily folks, at least in the sort of Silicon Valley and San Francisco area, continue to be optimistic. However, I would argue that's kind of manufactured, because we're just not building almost any new product here.
Yes.
And AI seems to be insatiable in terms of hiring and salaries and that kind of thing. And it's rent growth is now, we're seeing in Oakland, which is sort of like one of these last markets, I think, in this region to kind of pick up. Similarly in Seattle, we are seeing no new development. I wouldn't say no new development, but it's off by a huge margin.
But yes,
from
the
where
order of magnitude is
things
way
are.
down, no doubt.
Yeah, and so we're probably going to see some rent growth there because of supplies. But again, it's not going to grow because of sort of healthy kind of things, right? If I can say that, I don't know if that's too harsh to sort of say that, but healthy in a sense that we just don't have enough supply, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's been the Bay Area's bane for 20, 30 years now. Even in a huge, even in 2021, 22, the amount of inventory that was delivered in the Bay Area was a lot of units on a nominal basis, but compared to the existing inventory, it was in the mid-single digits. So it's not like other growth markets where they were seeing 10, 15 larger percent growth. I mean, we invest in Vancouver, Washington, just to the north of Portland, on the other side of the river, and that inventory grew 50% in 10 years of multifamily. We just don't see that in the Bay Area for a number of reasons. It's certainly harder to build here. It's more expensive to build here. It's greater regulatory burdens, CEQA, so on and so forth. But Yeah, I mean, being an incumbent in the apartment business is great. I remain skeptical that California will ever build its way out of its housing shortage, but we'll see.
That is, I think you're right. Unfortunately, not in our lifetimes. I'm curious. So, what are your thoughts? I mean, what are some of the numbers that you're seeing? Kind of, seeing that this MOU is falling apart. The cost of oil seems to be back up again. This will clearly have an impact on inflation and just cost of living in general. From some of the reports, Q2, maybe early Q3, in the indicators, do you foresee, interest rates to keep going up? What does this mean for the multifamily space?
Yeah, certainly higher interest rates, all things being equal, are going to translate into fewer transactions. I think if I've never been a great prognosticator, I've said many times if I was, I would have retired a long time ago. But I would argue the administration and the president is very heterodox all over the place and very much a business person, headline thinking exposure. So to me, I would be very surprised if the current stance doesn't fold much like it did during the MOU when there was back and forth on that, because I do think the president will see that inflation's increasing, the mood of the country is sour, won't do well for the midterm election. So I'd be surprised if the conflict really escalated to the point that Iran capitulates. So I think we're kind of stuck in this nether region for for some time, and then the world will largely get used to it, or it fades from the exchange of military actions, and we kind of get back to where we were before the MOU fell apart. How that translates to the multifamily space, I think we remain continually focused on, for our business specifically, for JB Matteson, on the acquisition side, we continue to remain focused on fundamentals within the market that are specific to the acquisition opportunity. What does the supply demand look like? What are the job drivers? Is it diverse job growth? Do we have diverse renters, resident profile to allow us diversification we're not exposed to any of the industries or those risks on an overly impactful basis. I do think in the context of, from multifamily, last comment I'll make on that, Vlad, is we're currently fundraising for an acquisition, and I would say it's not difficult, but it's not easy. Certainly it's summer, there's a lull, people are on vacation, but there's not huge interest in real estate given what the stock market's done. And there's also a lot of uncertainty. People are on the sidelines.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting, and I think this kind of reminds me. We just saw a report from CalPERS that actually had very good returns. Above average, sort of 14 plus percent, but on the real estate side, closer to 6.5% in terms of return on their money. So yeah, it's an interesting time for the industry for sure. To close off here our conversation. We now jump to our little microscope, telescope conversation, and I try to make it a little bit lighthearted here. There was one discussion that you and I recently had, and it was followed up by an article that I saw just like a day later. And this is one of those kind of, only San Francisco or maybe only sort of urban kind of stories. But apparently, if you are an elevator operator, or a mechanic, or of elevators, better said, you can count on having a very good salary, get a continuous amount of work,
and job security, right?
And job security, yeah. So apparently, this is one career that I can guarantee my kids are not going to want to get into, but certainly could provide a living for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
The building stock, whether it's in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, some of these buildings are approaching, 100 years old, right? The elevators and the mechanics that have used to, power them are outdated. I don't even know where to get, the supply of, materials. Do they 3D print things now? I have no idea where they find whatever they need to, fix and replace, but over 130,000 annual salary in San Francisco. which I should add, Tom, I'm not really sure you can afford a whole lot with that salary in San Francisco to begin
True.
with, correct?
True. Yeah, not unless your parents help you out with a down payment. But yes, yeah, I have two college graduates, my daughters, and I don't think they're interested in those kind of fields. Although I maybe a little bit tongue in cheek encourage them to work in something that won't be replaced by AI. Going back to a prior topic, and it is interesting just thinking about historically, 100 years ago, or currently, our country's like 85% service jobs, whereas 100 years ago it was the inverse. So I'm not saying we're going back to that, but maybe there'll be some more transition to more of your manufacturing service jobs, given what is happening in AI and the demand for these kind of roles and jobs. Just because, when I was growing up, my parents went to college, and it was always like, you're going to go to college, get a 4-year degree. That's the same kind of mentality I passed along to my children, but maybe that wasn't the right thing to necessarily focus on.
Right, right. Work in front of elevator, man. Company may have paid of dividends earlier.
Yes.
It is interesting. I do agree. There will be a clear delineation in sort of labor that is sort of AI, not AI focused. You and I also know, and we talked about industrial a little bit. This is kind of a highlight of some of the things that we've heard here in the Bay Area. But one of the biggest industrial occupiers as of late, or one of the busiest, maybe I shouldn't say big, because there are, but certainly busiest has been these companies called physical AI, which is basically robotics, right? And these robots are coming for definitely the cooking, the driving, the all kinds of other jobs. It'll be interesting, sort of what happens to elevators. Maybe they'll invent something new to move people up and down.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I want to say I read an article about workers in South Korea striking because they brought in robots to do their work.
Right. Yeah,
So
we'll see more of that. We will definitely
yes,
see more of that.
yes, the robots are coming. But yes, I mean, it goes to a comment I made about prior technologies. Historically, technologies has led to jobs that we didn't even think would exist prior to that technology being invented. So
Right.
time will tell.
Yeah, that is the hope. That is certainly the hope.
Yes, fingers crossed. That is the hope.
Tom, before we finish, is there anything else on your end to highlight?
No, I think that we covered some interesting topics today, Vlad. Always great to spend time together. Interesting things going on in our industry, and certainly, peeled to watch the headlines and find out what happens on a macro basis. And then once the summer's over, and our politicians will be in full-throated election mode, and we'll see what transpires once that happens.
100%. I think the second half of 26 promises to be an exciting one, whether it's fun excitement or sad excitement. I don't know. We'll see.
Yes,
but
we
it'll be
will see.
exciting. As somebody that you and I know really, really well says, it'll either be a great experience or a great story. So one of those
Yes.
things will be true. Wonderful. Well, Tom, great to see you. Wonderful having a conversation with you. Have a great rest of the week and stay well.
Fantastic, Vlad. Thanks. Same to you, and always enjoy our time together. Have a wonderful weekend.